Who all bleeds blue in this classroom? I know I do. The Blues organization has been a huge part of the St. Louis community from as far back as 1967. I've grown up in the St. Louis region, a lifelong Blues fan. I've went to hockey games, I've went to practices, I've asked for autographs, I watch as many games as I possibly can, and I've also researched the Blues organization. Today I have three important topics to talk to you about. One is the history of the St. Louis Blues organization. St. Louis hockey has become a hotbed for young amateur talent, and then the 2019 Stanley Cup Championship. The first thing we'll discuss are some key moments in the St. Louis Blues organization history, brought to you by Michael Faber and Alex Prewitt, a Sports Illustrated article on June 3rd, 2019, The Long Way Back. In 1967 and 68, the Blues were introduced as a new franchise to the NHL. There were originally 6 teams prior to that year. They also added 5 other teams, 6 total teams to the league, bringing it to 12 teams. In 1970, the Boston Bruins beat the St. Louis Blues in the Stanley Cup Finals in 4 games. This brought you the famous Bobby Orr flying through the air as he scores the game winner in Game 4 of overtime. As he's flying through the air, the puck crosses the net and crosses the goal line into the net. There's eventually a statue of this play put out in front of the Boston Arena. In the 1999-2000 season, the St. Louis Blues were the President's Cup trophy winners, which means they were the best team in the entire NHL and were the number 1 seed going into the playoffs. That year they lost in the conference finals in 5 games to the Colorado Avalanche, ultimately ending their season way early. St. Louis has become an amateur hockey hotbed. This information is brought to you by Ben Spiegel of the New York Times article in May of 2019. Thanks to the Blues, a hotbed springs up in St. Louis. There are many former players that have stayed in St. Louis or come back to St. Louis to really help grow the amateur hockey programs in St. Louis. In the 2016 NHL draft, there were 5 St. Louis kids drafted in the first round of the NHL entry-level draft. This is huge. It shows the program in St. Louis has really come to life and brought them to a top-tier amateur hockey spot on the map. Finally, the 2019 Stanley Cup Championship. I bought a banner. How about you? The Blues were set up to be a huge powerhouse in the 2018-2019 season by bringing in key free agents and doing what they needed to do to really put themselves on the map. And they came out of the preseason as favorites to win the Stanley Cup. After many heartbreaking losses and just a dreadful start to the season, the Blues fired their coach, Mike Yeo, and replaced him with interim coach Craig Berube about halfway through the season. Pat Maroon, the hometown kid, also grew up playing in St. Louis. He took a pay cut in free agency that year to come to St. Louis to play in front of his St. Louis hometown fans and to try to win a cup for St. Louis. He had a rough start as well. Craig Berube really helped change his season around. So in the end, the Blues were the 2019 Stanley Cup champions in dramatic fashion. I hope you have a better understanding of the St. Louis Blues organization. We brought you key moments in Blues history, St. Louis hockey amateur talent, and then the 2019 Stanley Cup champions. Do you bleed blue?